This is part 2 of the Westerlands. If you haven't watched part 1, I have a link to it in the video description and comment section down below. In part 1, I described the Westerlands, talked about the first men coming over via the Arm of Dorne, and how Lan the Clever swindled the Casterlys out of Casterly Rock and the Lannister line was created. In this video, I want to discuss the first true Lannister king, the Andal's arrival, and how the Westerlands dealt with it. So let's pick back up talking about the first Lannister king. Though Lan the Clever took Casterly Rock and created the Lannister line, he was never called a king himself. However, the title was given to him after death. But the first true Lannister king was actually called Lorien Lannister, who also went by Lorien the Lion. And as I go through the Westerlands, you'll see a lot of the Lannisters took out nicknames, such as the Lion or the Golden, which makes sense as they had blonde hair and lots of gold, and a sigil that featured a lion. Kind of a no-brainer for nicknames. Lorien dubbed himself the first King of the Rock, and quickly went to work claiming more territory and bringing more power to his house. In order to bring in more territory and more vassals, at one point he wed a daughter of House Rain. He also slew Morgan Banefort, the Hooded King, and his thralls during his reign in a war that's said to have lasted 20 years. Did it actually last 20 years? Hard to say with stories and accounts from that long ago, but it wouldn't be the first war that went on that long in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. So we'll say it went on for up to 20 years. And there's actually a fun little side story to that. Morgan was the last hooded king of House Banefort, and said to have been a powerful necromancer that apparently knew how to hold grudges. As Morgan died, defeated by King Lorien, he cursed his vanquishers. One day, he claimed, he would return from the grave. So Lorien, obviously fearing the man's curse would come true, and being a practical man, decided to cut Morgan's dead body into pieces and fed them to his lions. Try coming back from the grave after that, evil necromancer. Unfortunately, necromancers may be craftier than what we give them credit for. 2 years later, the lions somehow broke free within Casterly Rock and killed 3 of Lorien's sons. So I guess in a way, Morgan kept his promise. Maybe. I'm going to count it. After King Lorien died, his sons and their sons ruled for thousands of years, still stylizing themselves King of the Rock. And all seemed well for some time. The Lannisters had their territory, but not the entire Westerlands just yet. This would all change when the Andals arrived. Due to them landing on the East Coast, it understandably took the Andals a bit to head over to the West Coast. They first took over the Vale, with a little treachery, but that's another video series, and defeated the first men in the Riverlands. Long after that, they finally arrived in the Westerlands, ready to fight. Despite the other kingdoms and regions of the Seven Kingdoms being successfully taken over, for the most part the Northerners managed to keep the Andals out, the Lannisters still chose to fight. The first Andal warlord that came to their territory was attacked while going through the hills of the Westerlands. King Tybolt Lannister, also called Thunderbolt, I love that nickname, brought the Andal warlord and his army to their knees. So the first Andal attack was actually successfully beat back. But if you know your Andals, you know they don't give up that easily. After the first attack, more Andals came to the Westerlands in an attempt to conquer them. The second and third attacks were quickly smashed, just like the first one. But that didn't stop the Andals, who kept coming in waves and waves of both large and small groups. Finally, King Tyrion III and his son, Gerald II, knew it was only a matter of time before they conquered them, as they saw larger and larger Andal groups invade the Westerlands. Instead of fighting like those before them, the two men decided on diplomacy. The Maesters agree that King Tyrion and his son Gerald were sage kings, as they carefully arranged marriages for the more powerful of the Andal war chiefs with daughters of the great houses of the Westerlands. Being intelligent and knowing what happened in the Vale under the Andals' attack, they also went a step further. The Lannisters asked for the sons and daughters of Andal lords. These children became wards and served as pages, cupbearers, and squires at Casterly Rock. And of course, hostages if the Andal lords got any funny ideas. Or rather, stabby ideas. This relationship between the Lannisters and Andals was a huge deal. This is one of the few examples of the Andals actually allowing a territory with a king of First Men origins to expand their power. As time went on and to further cement their alliance with the Andals, Lannister kings began to wed their children to Andals. Eventually, these marriages led to the first Andal taking the throne as King of the Rock. So when King Gerald III died with no sons and one daughter, who was married to the Andal Joffrey Lyddon, a council decided that he was good enough, married to a deceased king's only daughter, crowned him and gave him the last name Lannister, and declared he was the first Andal to rule the Rock. This was a big step towards furthering the First Men-Andal bond in the Westerlands and with the Lannisters. The Maesters point out that other noble houses were born from these Andal First Men unions, including Brax, Merbran, Drox, Jast, Leford, Perrin, Kendall, and Sarsfield. Although the Lannisters and Andals were getting pretty tight, the Westerlands still weren't completely under Lannister control yet. There was still plenty of conquering and expanding to do, which the Kings of the Rock were all too happy to be a part of. Syrian Lannister defeated 3 lesser kings when they made an alliance against him. Through their defeat, he managed to push out the Lannister border as far east as the Golden Tooth and its surrounding hills. Next, Tommen Lannister built a huge fleet so that he could bring Fair Isle under the control of the Lannisters. Tommen married the daughter of the last Farman king of Fair Isle to further solidify his hold on the Isle. Later, when King Lorien II took the throne, he held the first tourney ever in the Westerlands and managed to defeat every single knight that went against him. But the Lannisters didn't stop there. King Lancel Lannister, also known as Lancel the Lion, went to war against the Gardener Kings of Highgarden. This guy was incredibly impressive and conquered the Reach all the way down to Old Oak before dying in battle. But as we see plenty of times in our own history, the achievements of the father can quickly be lost by the sons. When Lancel's son, Lorien III, came to the throne, he lost everything his father had obtained in the Reach. Because apparently the thing to do is make barely veiled references to a man's penis when he doesn't live up to your expectations, this led to the man being called Lorien the Limp. I'm sure you did your best, Lorien. The Limp was followed by better kings, though. King Gerald Lannister, also known as Gerald the Great, earned his nickname by raiding the Iron Islands during his time as King of the Rock. In his raid, he took back 100 Ironborn hostages before returning home. And if you think that is random, it isn't. The Ironborn were constantly hammering the West Coast and the Westerlands. The Ironborn were the flies in everyone's soup, sometimes knife in their back, for a long, long time. So this was actually a smart, calculated move by Gerald. With his 100 Ironborn hostages in the Westerlands under lock and key, he vowed to hang one prisoner every time the Iron Men dared raid his shores. So I don't know if the Ironborn thought he was bluffing, they didn't care about the hostages, or they just can't help putting their hands in cookie jars that just don't belong to them, but they still decided to raid the Lannister shores. But I guess what they didn't know is that he wasn't bluffing, and Gerald ended up hanging 20 of the hostages. And if you thought the Ironborn would learn their lesson from this, you don't know how thick the Ironborn are. Sometime later, they attacked Land's Point. The battle was called Battle of Land's Point, very creative, and King Lancel IV is said to have beheaded the Ironborn king, Harold Halfdrowned, and his heirs in a single stroke of the Valyrian steel greatsword, Bright Roar. A Valyrian steel sword the Lannisters bought a century before the Doom of Valyria, which will have its own video. After this, King Lancel decided he wanted a piece of the Reach for his kingdom. While the King of the Reach, Giles III Gardener, was having it out with the Storm King in the east, King Lancel invaded. This invasion did not go well, and Lancel was killed in the battle at Red Lake by Wilbert Osgrey, the Little Lion. But not before Lancel mortally wounded Wilbert with Bright Roar. With the death of their King of the Rock, the Westermen headed home. In all this, Lancel did manage to help out the Stormlands, though. In attacking the Reach, he forced the King of the Reach to return from the Stormlands to deal with the Westerlands in his territory. Had Lancel not done this and forced the King's return, the King of the Reach may have completed his conquest of the Stormlands. So, Stormlands, you actually owe the Westerlands just a little bit. Of course, just not the Ironborn caused issues. Sometimes the Riverlands and their many kings and petty lords also attacked the Westerlands. Torrens Tig, founder of House Tig, once seized a fortune in gold from an attack on the Westerlands. And we know some of the eastern hills that were once ruled by the kings of the rivers and the hills are now a part of the Westerlands. But let's move on to some of the not-so-great Lannister kings. While some were wise, brave, and open-handed, other kings of the Rock didn't quite match up. King Norwyn Lannister was known as Norwyn the Niggardly for how petty he was. King Lorien IV, also called Lorien the Lackwit, wasn't the smartest king and known for being feeble, weak, and cruel. He was dubbed Queen Loria when it was found out he loved to dress in his wife's clothing and wandered the Lannisport docks as a prostitute. Sadly, because of his love for women clothing and role-playing, the name Lorien was rarely used for future kings, and the name died out quite a bit in the Westerlands. The Lannisters also had some kings with dark tendencies. King Tyrion II, the Tormentor, was a strong king that could wield a battle axe in battle like none other. However, he was called the Tormentor for a reason. He loved to torture people. It is believed he could not desire a woman and sleep with her until first he made her bleed. Now, how much he made these women bleed is a guess. I'm hoping it wasn't full-on stabbing, but maybe a little paper cut. Great kings, bad kings, and somewhere in between, the Lannister territory finally expanded to include the western shore to the headwaters of the Red Fork and Tumbleton, and from the southern shore of Iron Man's Bay to the borders of the Reach. These boundaries are pretty much the same for the Westerlands in modern Westeros time. Though before the Targaryens' arrival in the Seven Kingdoms, Lannister territory could change a little bit from invasions and other conflicts, but they would always be reconquered all over again. To the east, they were constantly contending with the Kings of the Trident, and to the south, they went up against the Gardeners of the Reach repeatedly. Because the Westerlands were so rich in resources and trade, and because their coastline was so close to the Iron Islands, they also endured raids from the Ironborn. Given how poor the islands are and the Ironborn's constant need to reeve, this should come as no surprise, though. For such a poor territory, how could they resist stealing from the Lannisters, who had tons of gold and silver mines, ore, and more? No mines in the world are as rich as those of Casterly Rock. Some mines have been utilized for 1,000 years and still haven't run dry. The Westerland's wealth was so well known that as far as the Shy by the Shadow, merchants asked travelers from the Seven Kingdoms if it were true that the Lion Lord lived in a palace of solid gold, and if they could really plow their fields and obtain gold. Because of how poor the Iron Islands were and are, the Ironborn and their greed for resources was cause for a new war between the Iron Islands and Westerlands to break out every generation. Not even periods of peace would keep the Ironborn away as they reaved up and down the west coast for salt wives and wealth. Because of the Ironborn's behavior, the Farmans of Fair Isle had a huge responsibility in guarding the coast further south. Farmans are said to still despise the Ironborn because of this. Despite this animosity, the Lannisters did try to make peace with the Iron Islands through marriages and wards. Harmonhor II spent his youth as a ward of the Lannisters at Casterly Rock. When Harmon became king of the Iron Islands, the King of the Rock married his daughter Lelia Lannister to him. Because of his Ironborn luck, this did not end well for Lelia's and Harmon's eldest son when he became King Harmonhor III and opposed many of the cultures and customs of the Ironborn. In a revolt, he was overthrown and his younger brother, Hagon Hor, took his place on the throne and restored all their old traditions. Both Harmon II and Lady Lelia were mutilated for their crimes of daring to eradicate Ironborn traditions. Lady Lannister's lips, ears, eyelids, and tongue were all removed before she was sent back to the Westerlands. As you can imagine, that did not sit well with the Lannisters, as Lelia's nephew now sat as King of the Rock, and he went to war when he saw what they did to his aunt. It was a war that resulted in 10,000 dead, 3/4 of which were Ironborn. Finally, the Westermen landed on Great Wick, destroyed Hagon's host in battle, caught the man, and then mutilated him and killed him in the 7th year of fighting. The Lannisters finally left the Iron Islands when word reached Casterly Rock that Aubrey Crackhall, a general who had been commanding the Lannister forces and killed the king, claimed kingship of the Iron Islands. The Lannisters did not approve and called their warships back and left Crackhall to fend for himself, which went swimmingly for him. He died super fast. Despite that, the war between the Ironborn and Westermen would go on for 5 more years, and finally, they would come to a peace agreement. When the Westerlands left the Iron Islands, they left them impoverished and in rough shape. All the fighting had drained the Ironborn resources, and the winter that followed their war was called the Famine Winter. 3 times as many Ironmen died of starvation than had died in the war between the 2 regions. But the Westerlands would soon have a new threat to worry about, and in part 3, I'll talk about the Westerlands and the Lannisters under the Targaryens. Thanks for watching, please like and subscribe.